I'd had my bare hands inside a beehive for 20 minutes when I felt it. That specific prickle on the back of the neck that means you're being watched. And I turned, fully expecting to catch my neighbor filming my hives for the city again, the way she'd done a dozen times across 3 years of open war. She wasn't filming. She was standing at the gap in our fence, the one where a board's been missing since before either of us moved in, just watching me, with a look I had never once seen on her face in 3 years. Open, unarmed, something close to soft. I opened my mouth to start the fight, because starting the fight was the only language we had, and before I could get a word out, she beat me to it. Quiet, like she'd been carrying it a long way and was finally setting it down. "It's about time," she said. "My name is Cal Whitlock. I'm 35, and I keep bees for a living, which sounds like a poem until you've been stung on the eyelid on a Tuesday. I run about 30 hives, sell honey at 2 markets and to a couple of restaurants. Rent the colonies out to orchards in the spring, and otherwise spend my days alone in a backyard and a bee suit, moving very slowly among 40,000 small creatures that could hurt me and mostly choose not to. It's quiet work. It's solitary work. You learn to keep your movements calm and your breathing even, because bees can smell fear, more or less, and panic is a thing that spreads. I'm very good at staying calm around 40,000 things that might sting me. I had no idea, until that evening at the fence, how bad I was at it around one woman who definitely would. Her name is Margot Solis, and she is a 911 dispatcher, which I would not learn properly until much later, and which explains more than I had any right to understand at the time. She spent her days with a headset on, being the steady voice for strangers on the single worst day of their lives, talking a man through CPR on his father, keeping a teenager on the line while the sirens found her, absorbing other people's catastrophes 8-10 hours at a stretch. And then she'd drive home to a quiet house that backed onto mine, and she'd have nothing left and no one to give it to. I didn't know any of that. All I knew was the war. The war was 3 years old, and it started, as the dumbest wars do, over nothing that mattered and everything underneath it. The week I moved in and set up my first hives, a swarm peeled off and took up residence in her shed, and Margot, who it turns out is genuinely allergic, who carries an EpiPen, who had every reason on God's earth to be furious, came pounding on my door, and instead of being decent about it, I was cavalier, because I was new and tired and 29 and stupid, and I told her bees don't bother people who don't bother them. To a woman with an EpiPen in her pocket. I have apologized for that sentence approximately 400 times since, most of them silently. So she called the city. I let my pollinator wildflowers seed all over her tidy lawn, possibly on purpose. She retaliated by playing true crime podcasts at full volume on her patio every Saturday, narrated descriptions of grisly murders drifting over my hives all afternoon. I left a jar of honey on her step as a peace offering. Once, that first autumn, and she left it there untouched for a month and then put it back on mine, and I took that as a declaration, and we both dug in for the long haul. Notes appeared in the gap in the fence. Hers were masterpieces of cold contempt. "Your bees were in my hummingbird feeder again. I'm sure you're very proud." I'd answer in kind. We did not, in 3 years, exchange one warm word. The feud had rules, the way these things do once they mature. We never spoke face to face, that was the first rule, unwritten and ironclad. Everything went through the gap, or over the fence, or, in the worst stretch, through the HOA email chain, where we are both, I'm reliably told, legends. We escalated by season. Summers were the podcasts and the wildflowers. In the fall, I'd rake my leaves into one tidy pile, and the wind would mysteriously relocate the entire pile to her side. and she'd bag it and leave the bags on my driveway with a note that read, in full, yours, I believe. One memorable spring, she reported my hives to the county as livestock, and I had to stand in my own backyard explaining to a deeply tired inspector that a honeybee is, technically, a bug, while Margot watched from her kitchen window, not even pretending she wasn't enjoying it. I framed the citation. It is still hanging in my shed. I told myself I kept it out of spite. Spite, it turns out, is a wonderful word to hide other things inside of. Here is the thing I had told myself the entire time, and the thing that turned out to be a lie I was living in. I thought Margot Salas was the single greatest irritant in an otherwise peaceful life. I thought of her as weather, as the cost of the property line, as my own personal nemesis assigned by a bored universe. What I had managed not to notice for 3 solid years was that I checked the gap in the fence for her notes the way other men check the mailbox for a letter they're hoping came. That a fresh insult in her furious slanted handwriting could carry me through a whole quiet day. That she was, by an embarrassing margin, the person who paid the most attention to me on earth, and I'd rather have been hated by her, loudly, daily, than be what I actually was the rest of the time, which was a man alone in a yard that nobody looked into. I keep bees because I'm good at noticing small things. I can read a hive's whole mood by the sound at the entrance, tell you a colony's about to swarm days before it does, spot the one queen among 40,000, and I had missed the most obvious thing in my own backyard for 3 years, because seeing it would have asked something of me I wasn't ready to give. The evening she said it, there'd been a storm coming. I remember because I was out late checking the hives were strapped and the lids weighted. The light going that bruised green-gray, the air heavy and electric the way it gets before the sky lets go. I'd taken my veil off because the bees were already tucked in and calm, and I was just sitting on an upturned crate beside the hives breathing it in. The warm wax smell of them. The coming rain. It was a Friday, which I didn't yet know was the shift that hollows her out the worst. The all-night Friday she comes home from emptied right down to the floorboards, so she'd come out to the fence that evening with no fight left in her to pick. Which may be the only reason any of this happened at all. I wasn't doing anything worth watching. That's what stopped me. When I felt her eyes, there was nothing to film. No violation to document. No ammunition in a man sitting on a crate listening to his bees settle. There was just me. And she was watching anyway. When I turned and caught her, she didn't flinch back from the gap the way you would if you'd been caught spying. She held it. And the war face was gone, the sharp, braced, ready for combat face I'd been seeing for 3 years, and underneath it was something tired and bare, and that's when she said it. It's about time. About time for what? I said. Carefully, the way you move near a hive that's deciding whether to be upset. For you to catch me. She wrapped her arms around herself. The first fat drops were starting to come down, ticking on the hive lids. I'm not very good at being caught. I'm better at the notes. A breath. I've been watching you for about 2 years, Cal, not for the city. I stopped calling the city a long time ago. It went through me slow and warm and a little dizzying, the way honey leaves the comb when you finally break the cap. Not a jolt, a flood. And then everything I'd been not seeing for 3 years arrived at once, and I couldn't unsee a single piece of it. The jars. Through the gap, past her, I could see her kitchen window, and lined up on the sill in a neat row were the jars of honey. 6, 7 of them. Every jar I'd left on her step over 3 years. The ones I'd assumed she'd dumped down the sink. She hadn't opened a single one. But she hadn't thrown one out either. 6 jars of a man's honey, unopened, kept on a windowsill where she'd see them every morning. Because opening one meant surrender, and tossing one meant she didn't care. And she could not, it turned out, do either. The podcasts. Saturdays. Every Saturday for 3 years, like a clockwork provocation. And I understood, standing there in the rain, that Saturday is the day after a Friday night shift. The worst shift. And that a woman who'd spent the night being calm for screaming strangers had been coming out to her patio on Saturday afternoons and filling her own silence with the only company she could stand, the kind that asked nothing of her, and that the volume was at least half so that the bee-man next door would know she was out there. The war was the conversation. The provocations were the closest thing to hello either of us would allow. And the watching. 2 years, she'd said. 2 years of a woman who manages other people's catastrophes for a living coming home empty and standing at a gap in a fence to watch the one person on her street who moved slowly, who didn't panic, who sat among 40,000 stinging things and stayed calm, because my calm was the only calm in her entire day, and she'd been stealing it through a hole in a fence and calling it surveillance so neither of us would have to call it what it was. And the night the hives nearly died. Last February a hard freeze came through, the kind that can hollow out a colony overnight, and I'd been up at 3 a.m. wrapping the boxes in tar paper by headlamp, frantic, breathing into my fingers to keep them working. I'd assumed I was alone out there. I was not. I found out months later, sideways, the way I found out everything true about Margot, that her kitchen light had been on the whole time, that she'd watched a man she was supposedly at war with fight the cold for his bees at 3 a.m, and had stood at her dark window with her hand resting on her phone, ready, she admitted, to come out and help. And hadn't, because coming out to help would have ended the war, and she wasn't ready for it to end. But she'd left the light on, so that whoever was out there in the dark would know somebody else was awake. I'd seen that yellow window and told myself she was just up being difficult at me. She was up being on my side and didn't have a language for it that wasn't a fight. I'm a man who notices small things for a living, and I had let the biggest thing in my life run for 3 years labeled as a nuisance. We had been each other's whole social world the entire time, dressed up as a property dispute, because a feud was the only kind of closeness either of us was brave enough to commit to. The rain came down harder. She was getting soaked and not moving, and I had a choice, the same one I'd been ducking for 3 years every time I wrote a clever insult instead of a true sentence, and for once I made myself give her the way out before I took anything for myself, because she just stood unarmed at that fence, and I wasn't going to be the reason she regretted it. Margot, I said, over the rain. You don't have to mean any of this. We're both wet and there's a storm and people say things in the rain they take back when it's dry. So here's the deal. We can go back inside, both of us. And tomorrow, I'll keep my bees on my side, and you keep your murders on yours. And we'll go right back to the notes, and I will never once bring up the fact that you said it's about time to me through a fence. No harm. The war can have us back. You just say the word and it never happened. I made myself stop. But I'm done writing you clever things instead of true ones. So if you don't want the war back, you're going to have to be the one to say so. Because I've been a coward about this for 3 years, and I don't get to decide it for you in the rain. She didn't take the way out. For a moment she just looked at me through the gap, the rain flattening her hair to her forehead, and I watched her decide. I'd seen her braced across that fence 1,000 times. But this was a different kind of still. The still of a person setting down a weapon they'd held so long their hand had cramped shut around it, and you could see, plainly, how much the empty hand scared her. Neither of us said anything. The storm filled the space where the words weren't. A gutter somewhere was giving up, overflowing in a steady rope of water. And then, she chose. I don't want the war back, she said. Fast. Too fast. The words out ahead of whatever face she'd meant to make, and I watched her hear them land and go rigid, the way she must go when a call turns bad and stillness is the only thing left holding her up. She pushed on anyway, rain running down her face, and being brave out loud was so plainly not her native tongue that watching her do it took the legs out from under me. Do you know what my whole day is? It's other people falling apart in my ear. 8 hours of the worst thing that's ever happened to a stranger, and I'm the calm one. I'm always the calm one. And then I come home, and there's no one to be calm at me, and I'm just empty, Cal. I'm a dial tone. Her voice cracked, and she let it. And then there's this idiot next door in a bee suit who moves like nothing in the world can rattle him. And I started watching you. Because it was the only minute of my day where somebody was steady, and it wasn't me holding them up. I kept every jar. I couldn't open them, and I couldn't throw them out. I have spent 3 years insulting the only person who ever made me feel like I could set the weight down. That's the actual fight. I've been fighting how much I needed to look at you. I didn't move for a second. My hands knew before my head signed off on it. They always do. It's the bees. You learn to trust your hands before your nerves, and what they wanted to do was reach. So I did the only thing the fence allowed. I put my hand through the gap where 3 years of notes had passed, palm up, into her yard, into the rain, and I left it there, an open question. No veil, no armor, nothing in it. I kept your notes, I said. All of them. Every insult, in a coffee can in my shed, 3 years of them. Because they were the only mail I ever got that somebody wrote to me and not to a customer. I would rather have been your enemy than be invisible, which is what I am to everyone else, and I told myself you were the worst thing about living here when you were the only one looking. I don't want to be your enemy, Margot. I want to be the calm one at you. I've wanted it for so long I built a whole war so I wouldn't have to admit it. She looked at my hand through the gap for a long moment, rain dripping off both of us. And then she put her hand in mine, the first time we had ever touched, 3 years of neighbors, through a hole in the fence we'd both been using to wage war, and her fingers were cold and she gripped hard, like someone finally let off a line. That's the exact moment 2 of my bees, drawn out by the warm rain and the dumb luck of the universe, came drifting over and landed, one on the back of my wrist, one on her bare knuckle. The old Margot would have screamed and reopened the war on the spot. This Margot went still. Dead still, eyes wide, the EpiPen woman with a honeybee on her hand. And I said, low and even, the thing I always say to them, easy. Easy. Nobody hears a flower. And I watched her make herself breathe. Watched the bee walk a slow, curious circle on her knuckle and decide she wasn't interesting, and lift off into the rain. And Margot let out a breath that turned halfway into a laugh, shaking, and somewhere down the block old Mr. Aldecott, who had been keeping score on this feud from his porch for 3 years, who I am certain has a chart, hollered through the rain about time. Which is when we both completely lost it, laughing through the downpour with our hands locked through a fence, the 2 of us, finally, calling a thing by its name. We took the board out of the fence that weekend. Not the whole fence, Margot pointed out, reasonably, that a beekeeper and an allergic woman probably want some structure between their yards, and she was right. She's usually right. It's insufferable. But we took out the missing board's whole section and put in a gate. A real one that swings both ways. And for the first few weeks we kept startling at it. I'd catch myself drafting a cutting note in my head out of pure habit, and have to remember I could just walk through the gate and say the thing to her face, which it turns out is harder and better than any note I ever wrote. She opened the first jar of honey about a week in. stood at her counter and twisted the lid on a 3-year-old jar and put a spoonful in her tea and texted me a photo of it with the caption, "Fine. It's good. Don't make it weird," which from Margot is roughly a sonnet. The other 5 jars are still on her windowsill. She says she's keeping them as evidence. Of what? She won't say. I have an idea. By the end of that summer, the gate had stopped being a novelty and just become the way we lived. She'd come through it after a brutal Friday and not say a word, just sit on the upturned crate by the hives in the long evening light while I worked, borrowing the calm out in the open now instead of through a hole in a fence. Some evenings I'd lift a frame of capped calm out and set it in her hands, heavy and warm and humming with bees, and she'd hold it without flinching. The allergic woman, the EpiPen still in the kitchen drawer, because she trusted my hands near hers by then, and that turned out to be the whole thing. She told me once that the bees were the first thing in years that made her job quieter in her head instead of louder, that she could carry a frame for 10 minutes and not hear a single stranger screaming. I didn't have a clever note for that. I didn't reach for one. I just kept working, and she kept sitting there, and we were not at war, which took some getting used to and then, fairly quickly, took none at all. People on our street ask how it happened, and most of them already know the shape of it, because most of them watched it happen in slow motion over 3 years and several HOAM meetings. So, I keep it short. I tell them I'm a man who notices small things for a living and managed to miss the only one that mattered for 3 years, until a woman who spends her whole life being the calm voice for strangers stood at a gap in my fence in the rain and admitted she'd been borrowing mine. It wasn't a new thing that arrived in that storm. It had been there the whole time, passing back and forth through a hole in a fence, disguised as a war, because a war was the only way 2 lonely people knew how to keep showing up for each other. We just, finally, put down the notes and said it out loud. So let me ask you, what would you have done, caught in your own backyard, if the person you'd been at war with for years looked at you through the fence with the fight gone out of their face and said it's about time? Would you have reached your hand through, or would you have started the fight? Because the fight felt safer than the truth. And the bigger one, the one I really want to know. Have you ever turned someone into your enemy because being their enemy felt safer than admitting how much you needed them in your life? Have you ever picked a fight just to keep a person showing up? Tell me about it down in the comments. I read every single one. If this one reached you through whatever fence you've got up, leave a like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.